Hiya.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hello, I'm all right, thank you. How's it going?
Yeah, it's going well.
Cool.
Hello.
Hello.
You like my new hat?
Brilliant. Where are you both? Are you in a? Are you in
There's loads.
Hi.
Hi everyone.
As well.
Yeah, we're in Novotel.
Novotel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, where are you?
Oh, I'm at home. I live just outside of London.
Yeah, we're gonna I guess sort of just wait for people to trickle in.
Who's that, Heidi?
Oh, yeah, that's Heidi.
Really done. Her supplies.
Heidi and Sungu's there.
Hello. Might want your phone.
Did you feel a fine voice when you sing? Yeah. I appreciate it so much that you came.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Hi. Hello. Ah, there's Nick. Hello, Nick. I've just been quoting you this morning in an article I'm writing. So good to see you.
Wonderful to see you, Anne.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thanks, Anne. Nice to see you too.
Yeah, great.
Hi, Nick. You're right.
Yeah. Is this?
You need to mute while Nick's speaking.
Yeah, we're good. We're just recovering from COP and now getting ready for the WTO. It's just a crazy autumn.
Yeah. Wow. Well, good for you. Doing great work. I just want to say that I can't be very long on here. Is half an hour okay?
Yes.
Host?
Yeah,
Dear host? Is that Nick? Hi, Nick.
Hi. Thanks for joining us.
That's
Hi,
okay.
Anne, how are you doing? It's Kumi.
Hi, Kumi. Wow, this is wonderful.
Nice to see you.
African and South African connections. So good for the soul.
Okay, just a couple of minutes and
How are you feeling, Rob, after your verdict?
Yeah, pretty good.
All
I
right,
think.
good.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like the judge really wanted to find us innocent, but it's within the wording that there is no lawful defense. So it's hard to be found innocent when it's indefensible. But we've tried our best, and she gave us no costs, so she clearly was sort of quite on our side, which was really nice. Yeah, we live to climb another day. Okay. I think we're all here, just waiting on Sungu.
Sungu's here. No, oh no.
Is Sungu here?
No, he's not. He did say earlier on that he'll be joining. Oh, no.
Yes, hi. Okay.
Right, it's 5 past. I think we get started because Anne has to go and Kumi has to go as well, so we need to get going. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining us for the first of our hopefully many roundtables. We hope we hope to be doing these on the 15th of every month, which marks the month anniversary of our launch of the Jubilee for Climate launch on the 15th of October. We have a couple of hours scheduled, but as I just said a minute ago, Anne has to leave us after about half an hour and Kumi after about 45 minutes or so. So I think we should get cracking on. Once again, thank you very much. We appreciate your presence. We appreciate everything that you've been doing in terms of the work that we're trying to pull together as well. And ahead of this roundtable, Rob sent some questions to you for you all to sort of have a look at, think about, and respond to. But before we do that, before we get right into it, I'd like to invite Rob just to give us a
would you like to?
sort of background, just a brief background on the campaign we've started and why we started it. So Rob, over to you.
Hi. Yeah, so yeah, how to give a quick background. Obviously, I just want to also acknowledge everyone who's here today, and just the work everyone here has done. That's, the people in the audience are incredible activists, really inspiring, and people who've taken beautiful actions, and the panelists as well. Also, just as Anne is quoting Nick in an article, we relied on your work and in court recently. We've really that the work you do is so important, and I think that just sort of talks to the web and the history of this campaign in particular. Obviously, this is incredibly inspired by Jubilee 2000, but also work, by the concept of Jubilee itself, and a historical concept when we come to economics and finance in general that has been erased or just simply not talked about. And by not talking with that economic context, we lay the ground for the kind of economics which has got us to where we are today. So we feel really strongly that Jubilee and that way of thinking is something that needs to be brought into fruition. The reason why we're here is also very, very much the DNA of why we're here is from work we did last year with Africans Rising and continue to do to champion their work in the UK as much as we can, and just to really to try and enact solidarity and to work for this, because there is no solution to climate change that does not involve all of us, and does not have equity at its heart. So and that brought us really organically to the idea of the Jubilee and having a Jubilee for climate as a sort of positive solutions-based way of tackling climate change and galvanizing a new wave of a popular movement that is no longer just to put it within an XR context, to act now and to tell the truth, and to these quite nebulous terms, but actually to begin to hone in on what we're asking for, what that positive change might look like. And so the reason for calling a round table like this together is to bring you experts and people with loads of experience in this field together to talk about what a roadmap to Jubilee would look like, how to mobilize, thinking about all the different ways of mobilizing, whether that's in the way that Insulate Britain has mobilized absolutely from within the existing activist movement, or the Sunrise movement does the exact opposite. It chooses to not look at the activist movement and try and reach new people. And how do you mobilize? And then the final question to sort of pull those things together is where do we see it going in terms of the audience, in terms of the share of the political and the movement landscape? Where can Jubilee go? Where should it go? To provide a context and a context that is absolutely rooted in global justice and climate justice. And as we saw from COP, last thing I'll say before we get onto it, the one thing that really didn't happen was loss and damage. I mean, there were many things that didn't happen. But what that has said is that, that's a massive vote against climate justice. Lots of other things happened, but climate justice did not. And that's really important for the next wave of this movement. So is that everything, Nick? Should we move on?
Yeah, let's move on. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if we can perhaps pass over to you, Anne. I think we're all pretty much familiar with each other in this space at the moment, but perhaps a very brief introduction of yourself and then into the questions that were sent to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to be in this company and to be helping to support your superb campaign, which I think is, as you say, is extremely important. I want to begin with, yes, the question that Rob has just posed is how to mobilize. We need to remind ourselves what Jubilee was about. Jubilee was about periodic correction to imbalances. It was a process that was regarded as being ongoing. It had to happen over certain periods, and it had to happen that there had to be transformation of those imbalances and restoration of stability. So, and debt cancellation was one of the necessary actions for restoring balance, restoring stability. So I want us to remind ourselves that this is what has to happen, and what has failed, not happened at COP26, as you say, Rob, is that climate justice was not achieved. It managed to just rise to the surface of debate, but it wasn't achieved. And I think that's partly to do with the nature of the mobilization and the campaign. And I'm going to be a bit controversial here and say that one of our weaknesses is that we haven't united sufficiently. I'm at the moment quite rattled because The Guardian has written an attack on the Green New Deal. And one of the reasons it attacks the Green New Deal is because the Green New Deal unites everybody from Joe Biden to John McDonnell, they argue. And that they seem to think is a weakness. I think it's a strength. I think we need to be all behind one banner. The question then becomes, what is that banner? What is the Green New Deal? Or what is whatever the banner is that we have? We're all united behind. What is it? And I think that we've been a bit slow at arriving at an ask, at a demand, which is transformational and that can unite all of us. And I would like to suggest that what we have to do increasingly is not talk about climate change as a sort of passive process or as a process that involves all of us, but rather as a process that involves the top 1% or at the most the top 10%, because it's very clear to me that the crisis that we're in is not a result of the actions of millions and even billions of ordinary people around the world. Least of all is it the crisis of Africans. Rather, it is the crisis of the 1%. And by that, I mean these massively wealthy billionaires, but as well as the top 10% of the population earning really good money in all of the Western economies. But the top 1%, it's the top 0.001% perhaps, who, for example, would own not just one Gulfstream jet, but two Gulfstream jets. Not just one great yacht, but two great yachts. Not just one mansion, but mansions in every major city of the world. Now, there are people like that, you know, we could name them, right? And they not only have residences in every big city of the world, they also have residences, for example, in New Zealand, because they think New Zealand somehow will protect them from climate breakdown. And I think it's our failure to focus on that 1% and to demand of them that their wealth is deconstructed, that their wealth is diminished and shared and redistributed. But above all, that they stop doing the things they do, you know, like fly two Gulfstream jets and increase emissions. And I think that way we'll be able to mobilize a much broader swathe of society. We'll be able to mobilize that section of society, which, for example, voted for Donald Trump on the one hand in the United States, voted for Brexit here in Britain, and the nationalist forces that are growing in Europe, for example. And these forces are growing, as Karl Polanyi once argued, as a reaction to globalization and to financialization of the global economy. And that reaction is not pretty, it's not right, it's not progressive, but it's because it's not led by progressives. who, in my view, have gone along with globalization for far too long. So it seems to me that would be one of the things we really have to be thinking about as we prepare for a renewed mobilization of global civil society to tackle the injustices of climate breakdown and biodiversity collapse, but in particular to tackle the injustice of the process that we've just witnessed at COP26. So I'll stop at that point there, Nick.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Can I invite you, my namesake, Nick, Global Justice?
You can. I don't know if I have anything as well thought out or eloquent as Anne to say, but let me try and run through these questions, and very much agree with what you said there, Anne, as well. First of all, I think, you're asking what's the roadmap to Jubilee. I think for me, I would like us to be as structural as possible about this question, because what I always found with debt cancellation is there's the difficulty, in a way it's a positive thing, because it does bring together a huge range of people who are very supportive. But one of the problems is debt cancellation can be seen as a form of charity. And what we're really talking about here is system change, right? Changing the structure so that debt can't accumulate again, so that the global economy stops being a debtor's prison for some, stops being this tool of extraction by the richest, for the rest of us really, but particularly the global south in this case. So I think we've got to get something in there which is, and when you start talking about what the change is, you get into a lot of technical arguments about various debt workout systems and so on, which are quite hard for people to get their minds around. So I think there needs to be something about a more general kind of reform and taking control of and constraining of the financial system, which is absolutely at the heart of hyperglobalization. Yeah. And I think that should be seen as part and parcel of a Jubilee of debt cancellation. It shouldn't just be about, cancelling, even worse, forgiving this portion of money over here. It should be about thoroughgoing change. And I think that takes us from a kind of charity to a justice story, which is really important for us. I think, having just returned from Glasgow, you might be surprised to hear this, but I'm actually feeling quite optimistic, not because of the deal that was done, obviously, but because of the radicalism and the passion and the anger of some of the people on the streets, and particularly, a new generation of activists. It was so young. I mean, I felt so old there, really, but it was so young. It was so vibrant, and it was so different from the lifestyle decisions, the consumer decisions that have driven too much of the environmental movement for such a long time now. These young people were, by and large, from what I could see in the slogans from our own youth network, of course, were really focused on big transformative change. They absolutely got that there is no solution to climate change unless you deal with the neoliberal, neocolonial global economy. And I think that's such an opportunity for us. And our own youth activists put on their own demo on the third or fourth day I was there. We haven't even spoken to them, to be perfectly honest, very much about climate debt and the issues of debt. They were just there. I mean, the slogans they were chanting were all about debt and reparations. That's the other thing, climate reparations, which is part of the loss and damage conversation, but actually part of the adaptation and mitigation and finance conversation too. They really got that. And I just thought, wow, we've been, I'm talking about my organization, have been slow here in terms of reframing the global economy in a way that clearly interests a new generation of activists today, a new generation of activists who are inspired by the idea that they can challenge colonialism at long last and neocolonial economics, by racism in our own society, Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it. I mean, you want proof of how racist the world is. You look at the global debt system, you look at the global economy and the way that it works. And I don't think we framed it enough in those terms. And I was just blown away by how, without us doing anything really, those connections were clear to people, completely clear. And so I think there's really something to base this climate jubilee that you're talking about on. There's a real feeling. And I also think, and my last point, I guess, is I think that this that debt and finance more generally helps that job of making climate change more structural. I mean, again, the thing that gives me some hope is I remember being in Paris only 6 years ago, wasn't it? And half the debate was taken up with arguing against climate deniers. You know, with arguing that either climate change wasn't happening, or if it was happening, it was nothing to do with human beings. Right? That dominated so much of the media discussion. It dominated like what some politicians were saying in Paris. That's gone. I mean, that's just dead in Glasgow. There was none of that. And I felt as well even from the environmental movement, who again in Paris have been so much of this kind of, you know, it's about your own individual choices. Again, just much less of that. It was absolutely a transformative conversation. And I think that what you're talking about here kind of encapsulates and embodies that. And so it comes at a really important time. And I think the time honestly is really ready for this. So there's my top line thoughts, and hopefully I can be more useful in the conversation later.
Wonderful, as always, Nick. Thank you so much. Such an inspiration. And of course, the first ask in our manifesto is to transform the economy to serve people. And I think Daisy is about to share the manifesto in the chat in a moment. All right. Heidi, can I come to you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. And thank you also to Nick Dearden. I think that I would echo everything that he's said, not least because he's my former boss, as well as my predecessor here at Jubilee Debt Campaign. And it's really lovely to be here. Thank you so much, Rob, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I feel this is an amazing space with a lot of old friends as well as new friends. So yeah, thank you for the invite to come to this space. So when we're thinking about a roadmap, I think, you know, it's really good to kind of have a sense of where we're starting from and where we're going to. And for me, in terms of thinking where we're at the moment, 54 countries in the global south are already in a debt crisis. So that means diverting resources away from public services, health, education, which have long been serious issues for the global south. But now with the multiple intersecting crises of the pandemic and climate crisis, actually the debt is swallowing so much of the resources that are needed to fight on both of these fronts. And the responses that we've seen from global leaders to tackle the debt crisis and the climate emergency have been nowhere near inadequate. And nowhere near what we need to address the problem of debt. So that's kind of where I see our starting point. In terms of our vision of what Jubilee is, yeah, as Anne was saying as well, that the original concept of Jubilee was not just about debt cancellation, it was also about liberation and redistribution and equity. And so on this map, we need to go beyond debt cancellation and see the problem as a crisis of the economic system itself. It's like Nick said, the system, it's a system that is fundamentally racist, colonial, and completely rigged in the interests of a tiny handful of rich governments, wealthy elites and corporations. And so this roadmap needs to include how we oppose the underlying economic system and work with others across various movements for climate justice, tax justice, trade justice, aid, finance, so that we can collectively expose how this system is essentially rigged in the interests of a small minority, and start building our broader movements for change. But in any roadmap, you have your starting point, you have your vision where you're trying to head towards, and also the political demands to get us there. And I think in the short term, we need to continue building pressure for immediate debt cancellation around private sector debt. It's one of the fastest ways to release resources that are needed to tackle these multiple crises. And there are things that can be done in spite of what global leaders are telling us. Actually, there are things that can be done within to tackle this. So for example, getting legislation in key jurisdictions like England and New York to prevent private creditors from using the courts to force countries to keep paying out on their debts. We can build a movement and pressure around a UN Security Council resolution to order a suspension of private creditor litigation. And we can also build greater political and financial support for global South countries to default on their private debt, which also provides more pressure on private creditors to accept cancellation. And then, of course, from COP, we need to continue to build our demands around climate justice and debt justice, for climate finance, to push for more for the trillions in climate finance, not just the billions, and also really importantly for grants and not loans. And then, of course, as we've already mentioned, building the pressure for loss and damage. But in the long term, I think, we want to see a transformation of the debt system so that we can prevent kind of this reckless lending and constant debt accumulation. And so, pushing for something like a global debt workout mechanism, essentially creating a bankruptcy process for countries, because at the moment we have bankruptcy processes for individuals and companies, but not for countries. And so countries just have to keep paying out no matter what, creating a massive moral hazard in the system. And I think that we need to kind of go down this route around a debt workout mechanism in the longer term, because one of the lessons from the past debt cancellation of the 2000s is that if all we do is cancel the debt, we end up coming back to the same situation over and over again 10 to 15 years later. In terms of mobilization, I think that we do need to create a groundswell of support on debt issues. I mean, that for us as Jubilee Tech Campaign, that's why we exist. And, we work with other debt organizations and other campaigners across the world who are also pushing for debt justice. But the debt crisis isn't an isolated problem. We've already talked about how it's a symptom and a vehicle for neoliberal and neo-colonial control. And so though our focus is on debt, we need to build those broad coalitions for climate justice, racial justice, health justice. And I think for us as organizations based in the global north, or activists based in the global north, we need to find ways to continue to build power of those who are most affected by these issues, and deferring to their leadership, and ensuring their demands are centered in the work that we do, and opening up the space for them, and giving up our space and our privilege where that's needed. And ultimately, I think we need to also build widespread awareness of these issues, and break out of our activist bubbles. I think we need to kind of learn how to communicate all of these issues all over again. And I think the Jubilee 2000 movement took a very technical issue and made it mainstream. And we need to keep this issue back on the agenda and keep it on the agenda again and again. But thinking about how we expose this as an agenda around economic power. And so, for example, using things like, Rob and Daisy's and Ben's kind of amazing, courageous act of hanging that banner off Parliament, those are kind of actions, that the kind of big, bold, brassy actions that kind of get the public's attention, get the media attention to bring, like I said, what is maybe quite a technical issue into public consciousness. And that's something that we did when we were in Glasgow, and we tried to launch our Lockwood Debt Monster. And then, thanks to 50 police officers from around the country, they helped make that story go completely viral. So yeah, but again, it was our way of trying to get to popularize what is might otherwise be considered quite a niche issue. And in terms of where the Jubilee movement fits in the current ecosystem, I think that the Jubilee 2000 movement back in the 1990s had a really powerful resonance with people who were active in media, politics and activism in that time period. And I know that I've come across a lot of people who've said to me that they first got they first became interested in these issues. They got into activism for the first time because of the Jubilee movement. And I think that the Jubilee movement was a broad global coalition that was powered by faith groups across the world. But I think a lot of it, unfortunately, was rooted in a charity saviorism narrative, which was then hijacked by the big celebs who then claimed victory on the top line of debt cancellation, while sidelining the other demands that came from the wider global movement and from the global south to actually transform the global economy to prevent future debt crises. So I think, today, I don't think we can spin off the Jubilee movement as a separate movement, but I think that we need to build on the nexus between debt justice and have our demands for debt justice fully interconnected with the demands for economic justice and climate justice, racial justice, health justice, and build that solidarity between movements, and to clearly articulate that this is an economic system issue, and that, and then building power with and solidarity with other movements so that we can build our collective power in this space.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heidi. And yes, a lot of what you described there is precisely why we started this campaign, Jubilee for Climate campaign, to try and provide an umbrella, broad enough umbrella for as many groups and people as possible to coalesce under with various issues, which we recognize as all being tied intrinsically to the economic system, the global economic system, the dominant system at the moment. Now I shall pass to Kumi, you ready? Okay, to Kumi, who's the Global Ambassador for Africans Rising, as well as many other things. So Kumi, over to you. We can't hear you.
Folks, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Do you see something up on your screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So just want to start by endorsing very strongly what Anne, Nick, and Heidi have said. And unlike a tradition from the South African liberation struggle, I won't say most of the really good points have been made. However, for emphasis and speak for 1 hour, I'm going to be very brief and add just one point. I think I want to speak to the question of how do we mobilize. I think that part of the challenge of the way we have sought to mobilize in the past was flawed. That we focused too much on our people excluded, marginalized, repressed, oppressed, and so on, all of which we needed to do. But actually we did not sufficiently, though, notwithstanding all of those, look at what capabilities people still have, right? And that is unwittingly, I think sometimes we have taken away agency from people by focusing on all the devastations that they face. So this is a piece of work I've been doing during lockdown, trying to look at how do we create multiple pathways for people to participate in the global fight for global justice. So this could easily have been people's pathways to debt justice. Okay, let's just call it debt justice for the purposes of this conversation, right? So if you look at the top left-hand corner, it's harnessing our autonomy, and you read each of the bubbles on the outside from the center. People have power as citizens and voters, as enforcers of transparency and accountability, as shapers of our own destiny through movements, NGOs, trade unions, etc. Also, people have power as volunteers taking private action for public good. Then on the bottom left, people have harnessing our creative participation. People have power as custodians of ancient wisdom, shapers of values, ethics, and beliefs, makers of culture and all forms of art. Yeah, I would say one of the biggest challenges facing climate activism specifically is that it is far too jargonized. It's far too much about polar bears and whales, and not that that's not important, it is, but it's not human-centric enough. And there's a critical imperative, I believe, to bring the worlds of arts and culture and the world of activism, what we now call artivism, closer together, so that we can communicate the complexity and the urgency of climate change in such a manner that is accessible for people to understand, but also speaks to people's arts and moves them to participation. On the top right-hand corner, harnessing our wealth, which specifically, I think in a way speaks to the debt question. But yeah, I'm looking at the fact that irrespective of how much people have, if we can collectivize what people have, we have more strength than we actually think we do. So yeah, people have power as owners of capital and assets. People have power as owners of bank accounts, as holders of pension funds, insurance policies, and other products. If I take the example of bank accounts, in Australia, for example, the government has been trying to push the biggest coal mine in Australia's history and one of the biggest in the world in Queensland. And in 2015, after a year of mobilization where people picketed the banks, whether they're 10 Australian dollars, I beg your pardon, or $1 million Australian dollars, they participated together, and we were able to get all 4 banks in Australia to say, we will not lend money to that coal mine, right? Unfortunately, well, that slowed things down. It shrunk the size of the project, but through other financing methods. Sadly, it still has life and is moving forward. But we have more power in that space than I think we often recognize. Then at the bottom, harnessing our consumption. Our consumption power is a huge asset. It was mobilized during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, both at home as well as globally. And I think we need to harness our consumption power much more. And I would conclude by going back to the banks, which makes a connection with debt. I mean, this whole thing about too big to fail and too powerful to jail that we saw during the 2008-2009 financial crisis has left financial institutions, I think, are more reviled than even fossil fuel companies by ordinary people because it devastated people's lives. They have vulnerability. And if we are going to get accelerated change on climate, we cannot go after every single company that's doing bad things. We have to follow the money and shut the flow of capital at source. And I think the time is right for us post this criminal failure at COP26 in Glasgow, for us to intensify our efforts at going after banks and saying, you need to stop now lending any money to oil, coal, and gas deforestation and so on. I would just conclude by saying, in 2008, 2009, after the global financial crisis, the approach of those with power was all about system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. When what was needed then and what is more urgently needed now is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. And I've been doing this, trying to cause trouble for injustice for more than 40 years now. And I can tell you that this is one of the most, on the one hand, one of the most depressing periods to see this extent of the challenge. Are we running out of time on climate and so on? But actually, it's also one of the most optimistic times when I cannot remember another moment where humanity and the world at large was so ready for big structural systemic change. I think I've sensed it in Glasgow, as Nick said, and I think we need to jump on that and make sure that this Jubilee campaign that we are envisaging connects with that reality. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I also cannot stay for too much longer, but it was a privilege to be with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kumi.
Nick,
Yeah.
can I just quickly respond to that?
Yes, I was actually just about to ask you to, because I know you have to go. So,
Jumping in, so
yeah, do you want to respond to what you've heard?
So I think Kumi has really made some very powerful, has made very powerful points in this presentation, and he's right to collect, if you like, the degree of power that we have, and therefore how to leverage that power, to use the word of finance. But I want to make this point, number one, that the banks, the high street banks, are yesterday's story. They don't lend money anymore to the big institutions. They don't lend money to the fossil fuels companies. That money now comes from what's called market-based finance, or what is called the shadow banking system. So there is now another banking system out there in the stratosphere that is doing all the lending and all the harm, really. So that's a big story. But I want to just say this in terms of what Kumi is saying about power. That shadow banking system, that those big evildoers out there are massively dependent on public resources, and in particular on public central banks. And there we have a power which Kumi has not mentioned as taxpayers. Now, the value of the dollar, the value of sterling, the value of the euro depends on the fact that behind that currency is a treasury. And behind the treasury is a government that's collecting tax revenues that goes into the treasury, not just once, but every time we pay our taxes year after year after year. And the people who want access to government bonds, because it's the safest collateral in the world, know that we're going to keep paying our taxes in the future, that this is actually the government bonds are amongst the safest assets in the world. And that is a huge power that we have as taxpayers. We should say, I'm sorry, but the shadow banking sector in March 2020 cannot be bailed out by the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the ECB, when it collapsed the minute we had a coronavirus crisis, right? And if we are to bail them out, and maybe we need to because they're like the public sanitation system, they're essential to the whole economy, then there should be terms and conditions, and the taxpayers should demand those terms and conditions, right? But we don't even know we play a role in all this stuff. We think it's all magic going out there and beyond the stratosphere, it's beyond our ken, so to speak, when actually they depend so important. Without the Federal Reserve bailing out Wall Street, the world would have collapsed in March 2020, not just in 2007-9. They were bailed out in March 2020. And nobody, made a fuss about this. We just accepted it as given that that the central bank, which is a public institution, had to bail them out. So I want to add taxpayers to Kumi's list, and to say that we've got it, for too long, the right has gripped the taxpayer and treated the taxpayer as someone that always wants taxes reduced. I think we should reclaim the taxpayer and ask the taxpayer to demand terms and conditions of the bailouts of the financial system, which is today out there in the stratosphere. Sorry about my long intervention, but I was so excited by what Kumi was saying, and I just want to add that category to the list.
Thank you so much. And I think as Mia Motley reminded us, during COP, that since 2010, 25 trillion has been issued by the central banks of the world, and 9 trillion just in the last 18 months alone.
Here.
So, so we have that. We do have that power. Okay, so if I could perhaps next move to Sungu from Africans Rising, and then we'll move to Dario from CAFOD, and then Coumba, please. So Sungu, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Nick. I hope you are able to see me. My lighting is not very good. It's getting dark here. I'm in Mukuru. I've been in Mukuru the whole day. There's been, it's a settlement, a people's settlement in Nairobi. And there's been demolitions since last week. Over 40,000 people rendered homeless, and people are sleeping out like in the open in the streets. Even dogs and cats in the other side of Nairobi, I think, are living more dignified lives, more comfortable lives than the lives our people are living. And I think what is happening here in Mukuru still is a reflection of the larger problem in society. It's an integral part of what we are discussing today. And so for me, even as we talk about Jubilee for Climate, the thing that hits me most is how we connect struggles for ecological justice, struggles for racial justice, struggles for social justice in a very intentional way, and perhaps even move beyond struggling for ecological justice and now demand ecological sovereignty, because the way in which our environment, the environment we live in, is being treated, or rather is being misused and polluted, it's our own sovereignty that we are ceding by the day, because we cannot live outside of this environment. And so connecting the exploitation of people, whether it's labor, or whether it's the way these systems have lumpenized our people and reduced them to nothingness, connecting the exploitation of territories to the exploitation of the planet itself, I think would be a very important thing to do. I think that is a good starting point, because when it comes to that, we must historicize, we must problematize and politicize the debt issue. It's more and more people are speaking about debt today, but not enough people are speaking about it yet. And so we need to get people speaking and people taking actions around debt, because it's these debt repayment schemes that are leaving countries, especially impoverished countries, unable to commit resources towards fighting, for instance, climate change, or giving things like housing to the people. But I think the main thing I wanted to say was struggling for ecological justice in isolation. It's like what you were saying earlier, Nick. It's something that will only cure the symptoms while leaving the system that caused this whole crisis intact. The crisis we find ourselves in today. And so I think we need to mobilize around clear demands, like Anne mentioned at the beginning. And for me, one of those demands is ecological sovereignty. We have to escalate the nature of demands we are making and clearly link them to other demands which touch on the lives of our people, because human beings have needs and interests. And so we have to organize them around those needs and interests which determine the nature of their existence. But perhaps as I finish, there's increasing number of communities feeling the effects of climate change, especially in the global south, in Nairobi, for instance, where I am in Nakuru, which is right next to the industrial area. So it's a settlement which basically provides cheap labor to the factories and the industries and all these other establishments around. And they have decided to clear it to build a highway, which is a short route to the airport. And it's because other classes in society feel that they need to spend less time going to the airport. And perhaps the cost of spending less time to get to the airport is to evict 40,000 people plus. And so that is the place at which our society is. The humanity which might have existed in society before, most of it is gone, it is erased. And so for me, we have to find a way of centering our organizing around the people, because ultimately the people are our mountains. It is they who determine the trajectory of our existence. I think that's all I'll share for now. My phone is about to go off. In this place, they evicted people, cut electricity and water. So there's not even a place to charge a phone. But I'm really following the discussion with a keen interest, and I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. Asante sana.
Asante sana, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sungu.
Absolutely. What springs to mind is the path of least resistance in terms of capital. You know, that's why the 40,000 people are evicted from a particular place in order to make way for the highway. Wow. Thank you so much, Sungu. Okay, my dear brother Dario, wonderful to see you again. Please, it's yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Thank you to everyone. I'll just speak very briefly because I think a lot of things have already been said, to be honest. But yeah, so I'm Dario. I work for CAFOD, which is the Catholic Agency for Overseas Development, was one of the faith organizations that several people have mentioned that was very involved in the Jubilee campaigns. And I think Heidi can correct me, helped set up Jubilee Debt campaign a while ago. I keep on saying that, I'm pretty sure it's true. So yeah, CAFOD has a long history, and as I think Heidi said, a lot of people, CAFOD supporters, still remember those protests, and those were some of the first ones they went on in Birmingham in 1998 and other places. So yeah, CAFOD has kind of worked on this for a while. We've recently picked it up because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, obviously the debt has to be cancelled. That's something we've been very clear on. We've worked with Jubilee Debt Campaign, Global Justice Now, Christian Aid, and a few others. But one of the first questions you asked, Rob, was, you know, does it have to be kind of focused on debt cancellation or something else? I think we're very clear, debts need to be cancelled. We're not talking about suspension isn't enough, which is what the G20 has arranged over the past year or so. This is the kind of magnitude of this crisis. Debts have to be cancelled. But in terms of going beyond that, as several people have mentioned, this obviously is systemic. It's no coincidence there's so much debt in the first place that it is perpetuated. And just the fact that we are in the UK, most of us, and that just happens to be one of the key jurisdictions, the key financial centres, it just makes a lot of sense to challenge the power of the private creditors who are either based in the UK or held debt under UK law. That has been quite obvious to us. That's what we've been working on with Jubilee Debt Campaign, Global Justice Now, and others, because our kind of joint assessment really is that as long as those private creditors continue to get paid during a pandemic, that messes up any kind of debt relief, whether that's from private creditors themselves or IMF or World Bank or even other countries. So they really are the kind of core problem, as it were. In terms of kind of, not repeating 20 years later, we got possibly some debt cancelled and then kind of it all happening again. That is why we're also, calling for legislation in the UK, particularly on private creditors, some of the things that Heidi mentioned, so that private creditors can't sue if countries default or, can't pay, as the case with Zambia at the moment, for example. That's some kind of one to watch. So we definitely need legislation which will, hopefully be in place for a long time, and not just kind of, as in 2010, there was a piece of legislation which meant private creditors can sue, but it was time limited. So we need that to happen. And then ideally we would get a debt workout mechanism under the UN, which is, again, what others have mentioned, for that more systemic effect. I think in terms of mobilizing, recognizing that the private creditors hold huge power, they've heavily lobbied the G20 so that there's been very weak outcomes so far. They obviously have a clear stranglehold over this current government. How to counter that? I think linking to climate justice is a really powerful way, as well as every other type of justice, which, Jubilee for Climate, you're trying to integrate everything together, because we do need to bring more people in, as it were, to increase that pressure. And it's all interconnected anyway. So as several of you have mentioned, it's the same financial actors who are backing fossil fuels and deforestation. So it makes a lot of sense to intertwine what are already intertwined issues. So I think I'd kind of mainly leave it there, but just to say that CAFOD, we work with partners in the Global South on debt justice. We're working with partners in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, and they are doing work in terms of raising systems awareness, mobilizing to try and counter corruption, try and have responsible lending, try and see what the borrowing was for in the first place. So in many cases, in Mozambique, literally there were very dodgy deals where citizens never even saw what the money was for at all. But just to say that, so we are supporting in those countries who are doing that really crucial work. It's governance, transparency, holding their own politicians to account for why debts are taken in the first place. And there is crossover there in terms of the private creditors. So like in a country like Zambia, for example, they owe a lot of money to private creditors at very high interest rates. What was that used for is kind of debatable. So we will continue kind of supporting and working with those partners. And in a kind of dream world, there would be, for example, some of them in Zimbabwe proposing things like citizen debt tribunals. And if those were to, that's not an official legal process. It's I'm sure many of you come across these kind of citizen tribunals. There's one on the rights of Mother Earth, for example. They've been on many issues. But if those citizen tribunals in, for example, Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, were mentioning the same private creditors that are here in the UK, and we're also talking about them, then you start to build that kind of south-north kind of linkages. And that's definitely what the private creditors don't want. So I'll just leave you with that tantalizing dream that maybe we can realize together.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you. And we'll come back in a moment to discuss that, I'm sure, with reflections. You touched on Oyoo's debts there, which I think is something that we haven't mentioned quite a lot so far. Anyway, so Coumba Touré, are you ready?
Yes, thank you so much. My connection is going in and out, so I've been getting from one device to the other one. Mm-hmm. I'm just so happy and excited to see all of you, and just picking up from where you just left us on that tribunal. This is something I'm currently working on. I am one of the coordinators of Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity. And I also am very much involved in writing and stories and publishing children's books. And those tribunal and the use of drama is really something that I'm seriously working on, and actually working with a team of artists and people who do theater here in Senegal. But I also know that there are big groups organizing, including in Burkina Faso, in Ouagadougou, every other year when there is not the big film festival, the FESPACO, there is a Pan-African Festival of Theater, and they have a serious and amazing tradition of theatre forum, which is actually a theater that is not just played for people to see, but also where it involves people to actually play in the theater and change the situation. So it's an amazing tool of really bringing people. I heard earlier people speaking about how do we bring in people who are not activists, or who are not part of our circle, but people who just want to go and have fun and listen to a theater piece, or the things be able to be brought into these conversation in that way. So I'd love to pursue this work with you. I'll do what I can locally with the group that I have here, but I'm going to be pushing with Africans Rising for next year to put it out on the continent, and have just the issue itself taken by different artist group. We can give a prize or make something to make sure people speak to it or do something about it, and reach other people about this. Not just about a few weeks ago, I think it's just two weeks ago, there was a big concert on that that was organized, and Fight Inequality Alliance was part of it, and they had invited us to produce different artists to do something. And I did I'll try to paste it later, or maybe somebody else can paste it on the chat. I did a voice note to Thomas Sankara, just to talk about the debt and how we're still struggling. But I think this way of speaking and this language speak to some other people than people who are engaged in the debt struggle. Basically, telling Sankara, hey, we're still here, we're trying to pursue some of your work, but we're still fighting the debt, and we still can't pay, and we won't pay, and so on. And Odilia from Sierra Leone, I sent her the voice note, and the next day she produced a song out of it that we put together. So there are ways in which we can figure out how to reach people differently. Now, the other piece that I want to really stress, and it was already said, is just again around the language we use and how we reach people about that justice and so on. Currently, I've been really pushing, this concept of theft economy.
Oh no, we haven't lost Coumba, have we? Oh, what a shame.
Goods and
Coumba, we lost you for a moment. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
We lost you. Debt justice. Not debt justice. Theft.
Yeah, I was just pushing the language of theft economy, and making it simple and very straightforward to people that there is an economy at work globally that is based on theft, and it's been based on theft for centuries, whether it's theft of people or theft of materials, and today, even the model of the debt, the odious debt and debt that you keep on repaying is the model of theft, just extracting from people in an immoral way, and many people can get that and can hear that as a moral issue. So that's really part of what I'm really pushing and working on. Also speaking to a constituency that I'm used to working with, especially women, and fighting against women, violence against women, for example. I pushed, and I'm going to share with you something that I just put out and already spoken at a conference we did this weekend with Trust Africa, is talking about also our continent, putting the image of Africa being like a woman, as a woman, who's asking for divorce, who has been raped, who has been violated, and who's looking to leave this relationship, which is basically an imposed economic relationship that we don't want, but we are forced to stay in it. And there is a constituency that understands that hears that and knows what it means to want to leave a system and not be able to step out, to be subject to violence and not be able to always get out of it, for different reasons, for even sometimes being afraid of retaliation, or not just having the mean to go somewhere else, etc., etc. So we will have to find different ways of speaking about this that will, resonate and speak to different constituencies, where people will see the images and the parallel and understand, okay, this is what we're talking about. And as it is for death, as it is for the the climate catastrophe that we are living with. One of the images that I use in terms of changes is that, listen, we've never seen the waters rise so fast, wind blows so strong, but in the same way we have to be able to respond in terms of changes in our societies. We cannot have changes every generation. No, it's day by day that we need to change and shift to be able to meet the way things change. If rivers or places would be different after 25 years before, or after 50 years, now it's like a year later, something is completely different. So yeah, I'll stop here, but I've been really, working and thinking through this. I'm not very organized in how I'm presenting all this. I just shared with Rob that I lost all my computers, everything, got a theft in the house. So I just came in not prepared, but just share some of the thoughts that I have.
Coumba, as always, thank you so much. Wow, how powerful some of the analogies you used there, just mind-blowing. And funny enough, earlier today we were having a discussion in our meeting about how to change the language, and Leslie, who's part of the group, was mentioning exactly the same points that you've been talking about. Thank you so much. Okay, so for the panelists, perhaps some reflections on what you've heard, and if we go back maybe the same way that we started. So Nick, namesake, if you go first. Oh, sorry, go for it, Rob.
Yeah, I was just going to also kind of to give, so that we don't come in cold and go, oh, suddenly we're going to have to speak again. Just to sort of say a few things that were also in the email and the sort of invitation to come here, which is, and another reflection on this is about DNA, the DNA of a movement, and for me, the historical idea of Jubilee, the DNA in that idea, is incredibly powerful, and potentially, can do so much just because that is the DNA. And so I think that's really interesting, and that's but there are still other things to talk about there in terms of what, for example, Anne mentioned about taxpayers, as potentially thinking about that as a target, as an audience, as a way in which to frame, relations. And so there's one sort of I want to sort of prime and put a prompt in about DNA, because it's from that DNA that any movement grows. And you can see, for example, if you track XR, which we have a lot of experience with here, I think, naturally, but also other movements, you can see how it's grown from its DNA and how that's sort of given it some of the problems, or also some of the, some of its great things. So a sort of prompt about DNA, and then I just wanted to add another thing that's in the email, is about what you want to get out of it, because it's always said that this is your movement. Everyone says this is your movement, but that for Jubilee to work, it really has to be without any sense of ego. It has to be about something that's flowing through all of us, and that we're all deciding to sort of take part in, and shaping together, and moving forwards together, and honoring the energies that are pushing it forwards, obviously, but at the same time, there's no ego. So I really want to ask, like, what everyone wants, to get out of it, and how we can make that possible. And just Coumba there prompted me to think about that, because she was saying, I think this is something, I want to bring this to Africans Rising in the African continent, next year, and that global linking and those things are so much a part of that, and also part of the DNA, which is amazing.
Namesake.
Thanks, Nick. And Rob, do you mean then, when you say DNA, do you mean the DNA of the Jubilee movement that we're kind of inheriting here? Like what is in that, and how should that inform us? Is that the question?
Yeah, a bit of both. Within the Jubilee idea, there's obviously, there's religious concepts, and there are also concepts that you could say, exist actually in other cultures that aren't the Abrahamic religions. There are, other concepts there that go deeper, or older, and also that are still happening today in practice. And Anne talks about it as well as being, that periodic, it's a periodic realignment. It should be something that happens, in the Jewish canon, it should happen every 7 years. So, and that's something that's sort of very vastly forgotten from this literature. So I mean that sort of as DNA, but also as justice. Jubilee, when it was linked through Jesus Christ, is obviously all about justice there. So that, and where it fits today.
Yeah, I agree. No. I think that's incredibly important. I mean, for me, it also says really quite a lot, doesn't it, about a neoliberal capitalist society that, even, 3,000 years ago, societies that were not equal, like these were not ideal societies we're talking about, recognized that you could not simply allow the ongoing accumulation of wealth in the hands of the few without seriously destabilizing society, apart from anything else. Right? I mean, this is the same lesson that Polanyi brought back to us, who Anne mentioned earlier in many ways, in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, it's only this crazy, fundamentalist free market system that we've got that thinks this is kind of acceptable and okay. And just let the market decide how society is run. And if it produces inequality, well, we just live with that. And we're seeing that that's not okay. And I think I think from that perspective, it's really interesting to look back at previous societies, even ones that, we might not share much love for other aspects of those societies. But I mean, they kind of realized from a very early point of human civilization that the kind of economy and the kind of society we've got now of endless accumulation was not a good thing. For anyone concerned, really. I also think, for me, one of the big parts of one of the kind of aspects of bit of DNA, or whatever you want to call it, in the movement, did spring from the liberation movements from colonialism. I mean, that for me was always part and parcel of it, was learning from those movements, and the way that those movements, when they'd won their freedom, came to power and recognized that political freedom, okay, it was something, but it didn't mean a hell of a lot unless you had economic freedom. And so this challenge of Jubilee, this challenge of how we get a control of our own economy so we can make them run in the interests of the people that we supposedly represent, is for me really fundamental. And you'll hear, certainly in the Jubilee movement, Jubilee South and whatever, we used to hear all the time this concept of sovereignty. And I think, you know, for some of us, that concept's been a little bit bastardized in recent years, because the right wing of the Conservative Party here has taken it on and used it as an argument for Brexit and so on. But there is that doesn't mean we throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. We throw the concept out as no use. There is something really important here. And you know, if we've got people here in Britain who seem to think that our sovereignty has been hindered by our being in the European Union for the last 30 years, how on earth do you think most countries in the world feel who have no economic sovereignty whatever? And you can see that in all of the things that we're working on today. And that's, to me, again, seems, you know, an important way of challenging kind of hyper-globalization, and something else that I think is you know, very, very important in this movement. And also, you know, we've talked about this a lot before, but remembering some of the heroes on whose shoulders we stand. You know, Sankara has already been mentioned and is an obvious person to talk about in relation to the debt movement, because you know, he was just so brave in the way that he challenged it. But a lot of these figures have been forgotten by a new generation, not just here, but you know, across the African continent, across the global South. These figures aren't well known anymore, and this gives people an idea of their history, which isn't very empowering. I mean, actually reclaiming some of this history, I think is really important for empowering people and showing them how we can do things in a different way. So I guess that's all on the DNA thing. That's what kind of comes into my head. What do we want to get out of it? For me, I think the big thing missing from our activism, I'm looking at this very much from a Western European perspective, but the focus on the global economy is not huge in our own countries at the moment. So that's quite a contrast for where you look back 20 years ago, the anti-globalization movement, the idea that these international institutions and systems were absolutely vital. We had to confront and challenge them if we were to build a better world. And I think that there is less of that today, although again, you know, the stuff that I've seen in recent weeks, and COP particularly, gave me some real heart that there was an opportunity to talk about that. But I think we've got to go through a real political education process. And I think that might be one of the things that this is so important. I mean, I find Jubilee a whole political education process in itself. What I used to love when I worked at Jubilee Debt Campaign was you would always start a meeting explaining what Jubilee was and what your take on it was. And, you know, within that, you have a kind of political education about the global economy and different perspectives and how, you know, there are alternatives, and this is how different societies have done it, and this is how we might want to think about doing it. That for me was incredibly powerful, and I think that what I would like to get out of this is, again, some ramping up of that kind of political education that I think is encapsulated in this concept here. So yes, there will be campaign elements to it, but I think there is much more to movement building than a kind of a few successful campaign actions. They are one part of this much bigger movement building. And I think I just leave it here to my final point, I think, to say the other thing that I really learned from my time at Jubilee was just how committed ordinary people in society who had previously no connection with these kind of issues became through that movement building process that they were engaged in. And actually, I mean, I got very annoyed for many years with the way that NGOs were too worried, too scared of getting into conflictual situations, and the idea that everything we say has to be agreed by everybody in society, you know, like which leads you to a very soft form of campaigning where you're not really calling for anything, any kind of change whatsoever. Like for me, Jubilee taught me a lot about how important conflict is actually in our campaigns, and how the activists that had to go out on the streets and defend like what often seemed like a very radical line to ordinary people in our society, and I'm sure lost lots of arguments, and would come back and think, oh my God, why did I lose that? What's the answer to that? And it would get them more and more and more into the issue and into the campaign, to the extent where they felt it was theirs. You know, and any NGO that tried to stop them talking, and this is why we still have Jubilee Debt Campaign, any NGO that tried to stop them doing this and talking about this, they were a problem. We just wanted to, you know, that they you know, it was their life. And that was, again, incredibly powerful. And I think as we're entering this period now, where, as Heidi's already said, the debt crisis in southern countries is not going away. It is only going to get bigger and bigger as an issue. And so the way that we frame that, the way we prepare people for that, the way we develop this international movement this is the key time to be doing that. And so, you know, thanks for all you're doing and for putting this together, because I think it's a really important thing to do.
Wow, amazing, absolutely, yes. Thank you so much. You raised so many points that I want to reflect on some, but if I can perhaps, Rob, anything, Daisy, anything? Maybe go to Heidi and then, yeah, okay, Heidi. Oh, very quickly, again, new superhero, Mia Motley. We can't solve global problems with national solutions. Amazing. Heidi, over to you for reflections.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think on the question of DNA, I think it's a really good question. I haven't really thought about it too much, to be honest. But I really like what you were kind of citing Anne, talking about Jubilee as the key to the concept of Jubilee is this idea of correction. And when you kind of cited Anne for saying that, it reminded me how we've come, you know, the state of in the current state of the world right now, that we, you know, the situation of inequality that we have it's been seen as a kind of a normal state that we're in, and there's a kind of a gross acceptability around it. This is why, you know, even though we did see kind of the streets littered of people demanding climate justice on the 6th of November, we're not seeing people up in arms at you know, the outcome that we've seen from this weekend, the climate emergency, the overall state of the climate emergency, the vaccine apartheid, the debt crisis, the pandemic, all of these things, because there is this sense that this is just the way things are, that we've kind of had this kind of latent acceptance of the of neoliberal, neo-colonial control, and so I think I like going back to this idea of Jubilee, that actually Jubilee was inserted, you know, into the Jewish canon because there was this sense that inequality does build up over time. And even though it might be inevitable because of the way power works, and the way power gets concentrated into the hands of, you know, the wealthy and the elite, it's nowhere natural, and it's no way acceptable, nor okay, nor tolerable. And so I think that's something that I think it would be, you know, something for us to come back on, and to and just sort of a little bit following on from Coumba, talking about, you know, thinking about language and narrative, and because ultimately we're fighting a battle of the story. Who controls the story here? And the story around, just for example, you know, net zero, efficient fossil fuel subsidies, like this kind of language is forcing an acceptance, like, sort of the current situation, but also sort of hijacking some of, you know, the demands that we're making. So where we're saying, you know, phase out fossil fuel subsidies, just adding the word efficient makes it look like they're ceding to our demands, whereas actually they're just masking their own neoliberal agenda, similar to net zero. Net zero kind of sounds like zero, and zero has become really dominant. I think so I really like what Coumba was talking about, sort of thinking about language and thinking about communicating this so that people understand it. And then just I think the other thing about Jubilee for me as well is kind of thinking about the wider principles of liberation and redistribution and equity, so that actually that's the kind of we have this kind of a broad vision that is ultimately about human well-being, human rights, to combat this idea of inequality being a natural state of being that we have in our world that we just accept. In terms of getting what we want out of today, I think, the debt crisis, it was here already at the start of the pandemic. It was made worse during the pandemic. There was no real action taken to respond to the debt crisis. And then when you add on top of the existing debt crisis that we've got with the failure at COP, to create a loss damage fund to address the problems of climate finance, all of this combined means that we are now anticipating a major global South debt crisis that is going to rip through the global South over the next couple of years, which will create mass instability in the global economy. And so I'm really hoping that the discussion today is going to galvanize wider movement into action to gear ourselves ready for this moment. It's a moment of great crises that we can, that the space starts to open up to push for transformative solutions. And because I do really think that the policies that the G20 have put out last year, they are all just kicking the issue into the long grass, but that long grass is coming soon. That this is going to erupt, and I really want us to kind of use this time to really build up our wider movement so that we are ready at that point to push forward our transformative demands when the debt crisis cannot be ignored. So I'm hoping that out of this meeting, that we can work together, we can keep talking to each other, organizing with each other, strategizing with each other, so that we can keep building awareness, think about our language, building and seeding our power to affected groups, building connections between movements, like I said earlier, between the debt movement, between the climate movement, the health movement, and the racial justice movements, and then ensuring that we have a story that is understandable and accessible, but ultimately is rooted in racial justice and climate justice as well.
Amazing, thank you so much. Your point about the net zero language, then I think one of the phrases that has gotten away with it for as long as anyone can remember is natural gas. What is so natural? Natural gas just makes it so saleable, doesn't it? In the public imaginary. Dario, reflections on what you've heard?
I don't really have much to add. I'm curious as to hear from people who haven't spoken yet, actually. So maybe I'll pass it back to you.
Okay. Thank you. I'm not sure if Coumba is still with us.
Yes, I'm right here.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Any reflections?
Really, I'm just so glad to be hearing each of you, and I guess what I'm trying to figure out and to get to is how we could almost build some type of it wouldn't be a roadmap, but a map of actions that people can take, from wherever they are. I don't know, you are a student, I heard earlier what Kumi was saying about the power that people have. Heard also, this whole power around the taxes and so on. What we could offer, I guess, to the movement could be very simple menu of actions that they can come and say, okay, I wake up and I want to do something about this, about that justice, and this is one thing I can do. I'm a student, or I'm a woman in the market, I live in Kenya, or I'm in the UK, or I'm somewhere else. This is what you can sign, this is what you can do, this is where you can go. These are the names of the people that you need to write to. I don't know, I was just on Twitter following you know, this guy who's, you know, going to space and back all the time. The Elon guy, and he was just, you know, he's just so, I don't even know how to say this. He was just so mean and childish, you know, in a response that he was giving to Bernie Sanders, who was saying that, you know, about tax, you have to check it out. And I was just like, hey, guy, you know, just manage to get to his age and still be respected by people before you do it. But I'm just thinking, if people are known, if the 1% are known, and the companies are known, and the people, you know, the whatever bank in the cloud, what's the name? What was she talking about? These banks that exist somewhere in the sky. I don't know who heads them. We need to get their names and get the people follow them. I don't know, on Twitter, on Facebook, anywhere, or just wait for them when they come out of their house and tell them, hey, you know, that bank of yours needs to stop doing this. They shouldn't just be so comfortable. And there are not so many of them, and there's so many of us. We shouldn't, you know, leave them comfortable. So there has to be ways in which we just be able to name them, and people can decide what they need to do and where they need to do it, how they need to do it, but they need to know where is it that you know, you know, our money, our blood is flowing towards. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you. And I mean, in relation to power there, I often say that the power of the powerless is much more powerful than the powerless know. You know, and by powerless, I mean those that have been told, you know, who have been told we don't have much power and we think there's power elsewhere. That's when we come together, we're absolutely very powerful. And of course, the authorities know that, and the people with power know that in various ways. If I can perhaps ask Nick C to, would you like to read out your question, Nick?
Hello everyone, I've got a really unstable internet probably, so I won't put the camera on. But no, I'm quite new to all of this. It's been very interesting listening to all of you, and I appreciate that your the demand around debt is a really good point of leverage and action. Just in my own like recent activities, trying to preserve a sort of ecosystem in the Okavango, trying to stop a Canadian company that's looking at oil drilling there and discovering that they're entirely funded on the stock market, makes it a very difficult project in some ways. But it also points obviously to the stock market, which is this, you know, freewheeling sort of complete, in many ways, under-regulated entity. And it's it just seems like there's to my experience at this moment, a question about how do we challenge that, which is very much a sort of global north challenge, because so much but then China as a entity, as everyone must be aware as well, probably much more so than me, is doing massive infrastructure projects under its Belt and Road sort of initiative all over the global south, and creating, as I understand it, also debt through that, but largely is just such a key actor in all of this, and has obviously got its own human rights and justice issues as well. You know, so recently sort of connecting with some of the Tibetan activists around COP.
Nick?
Well,
oh, okay, yeah, thank you. No, that's fine. I think you put a couple of questions in there. Nick D, I saw you nodding quite a bit there. Is there anything that comes to your mind either with China or addressing the stock markets?
Well,
I know you've been going after big pharma, quite a lot.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, yeah, I do. I mean, again, I think so much of it comes down to how we constrain the financial system and stop allowing it to have the power that we've given it, or our governments have given it in recent years. I'm going to leave China. It's complicated, is what I always say about China. I mean, it's definitely not an irrelevant point, because, clearly, there is a substantial amount of developing country debt owed to China now. My experience is that activists across the South take very, very different attitudes on how we should talk about that, how we should frame it, and so on. I mean, I suppose my main priority is to put pressure on the governments that were right at the heart of, the old empires that are at the heart of the financial system and so on today. And I live in one of those countries, so that's where my priority is. I'm very, very happy to offer any solidarity I can to people living in China who want to put similar pressure on their government, but I don't, there is such a problem in our media, as we've seen in relation to the final text from COP over the last 2 days, around blaming some of these countries, that I think it can be really hard for us to know quite how to message that, but something we should continue working on.
Wonderful, thank you. Heidi?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I actually went to, just before this meeting, I was actually in a Share Action training session, and Share Action, and it started off by actually putting out some facts about kind of to what extent our pension savings, banking products actually fuel the real economy. That actually a lot of 50% of our investments actually go to the big companies like BP and Shell, all the ones that we hate. And actually what they were talking about was how a lot of times investors don't assert enough scrutiny over where the money that they are raising through the stock markets where that's going to. So that makes it easy basically for big companies to raise funds through the stock markets, because there's because there's so little scrutiny either around the project itself or conditions to restrict those projects, or even just kind of asking questions about it. And actually a couple of really interesting things that they suggested in this training. The first of them are AGM actions, which is quite a really common tactic used in campaigns to, all you need is one share and you can get into an AGM where you can actually come face to face with the CEO and the most senior positions in the organization, the CFO, the CEO, and so on, and as well as board members, and can actually pose questions very direct to put them on the spot. It doesn't always create change, but it does create an assertion of our power in those spaces. And it also puts them on the back foot, and can get media attention as well. The other tactic, which I've done a few AGM actions over the years, but the other tactic which I've never tried before, but I thought sounded really interesting, is this idea of a shareholder resolution. That a shareholder resolution is where you need to get a whole, I think you need to get quite a big number of shareholders together, like about 100 or something, and Share Action can facilitate this this process. But they get about 100 shareholders together, each with about one or two shares each, and then they are able to put a resolution into the AGM. And if this resolution gets passed, then the company is legally bound to take that action. So this would be really effective for things like stopping fossil fuel investments from the banking sector. And I thought that was quite a powerful tactic. And Kumi was talking earlier about the power that we have, and actually I think some of these ideas sound really interesting. Like I said, I'm a bit more experienced with AGM actions. I don't have any experience on shareholder resolution, but that sounds like a really interesting tactic going forward, especially around fossil fuel investments.
Excellent. I think that is definitely something we can put on the list as well of possible actions. Thank you. Thank you. We have to look into that. Elena had a question. Elena, would you like to? Okay, right. Perhaps I'll read it out. So how much power do country leaders have in demanding debt cancellation in return for some COP agreements or buy-in? Surely they're currently using it to negotiate. Any successes there? Who would like to go with that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can make a go of that and make a start on that. So country leaders, so they can, they can, of course, they've got unilateral power over the ability to cancel bilateral debt. So that's the debt between themselves and a developed and a lower income country. The richest countries in the world have come together to set out a couple of schemes through the G20. So there's a debt suspension scheme and there's a common framework. So that has been put forward as a collaboration between some of the most powerful countries in the world. However, the problem with both of those schemes, actually, well, the first one is it's a suspension scheme and not a cancellation scheme, so that's already problematic in itself. But the problem with both of those is that there's no way to compel private creditors to be part of the debt cancellation and debt restructuring, which is something that both, I think, has he gone now? Yeah, Dario's still around. Dario, yeah, so Dario and I both kind of mentioned the problem around not having private creditors to the table, partly because they hold a lot of the debt, but also because it does undermine any debt cancellation that's happening on a bilateral basis between governments or in a multilateral space, for example, with the IMF, World Bank, because otherwise it's just public subsidies that are then going to go straight to line the pockets of private creditors. So I think there is countries, individual rich countries do have that power, and they've got a lot of power as well through the IMF and the Bank, and as well as multilateral spaces like the G7 and the G20. And then ultimately, actually, if the country, a really quick way to get cancellation would be to support global South countries to actually default on their private debt. And then by doing that, that's a way of putting pressure on private creditors to actually accept cancellation if they know that a country really is not going to pay, and it's got the political support from other powerful countries to do that.
That kind of brings us almost back to what Thomas Sankara suggested, all those years ago. But then doing it as single countries has very little effect, I think, and you're trying to encourage the whole block in that way. Dario, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Any reflections on that?
On what? Sorry, on the
on Elena's question, basically, how much power do country leaders have? And I think we're looking specifically at private debts, countries that have private debts.
How much power, as in the countries that own, you mean?
Yeah. What can they do about private debts?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, as Heidi said, one option is to, well, sometimes not to choose to default. It just happened, like in the case of Zambia in November of last year. But I mean, yeah, countries could, Argentina's had its battles with the IMF and chosen not to pay. So that's an example of a country kind of proactively doing it. I think Nick and Heidi can probably speak about it better than me, but there is something there in the citizens of countries, say like in Zambia, putting pressure on their own government to say kind of, where is the money, and like what has actually happened. I don't know if that kind of causing the country to default, but I suppose, yeah, in terms of the kind of what we're looking for here is it's not just, there's, I think one of the things Heidi mentioned, it's the irresponsible lending and borrowing, it's kind of happening on both sides. So, I'm not sure about country kind of, if we can push them to default. I know that comes up in some civil society circles about kind of, is that something we can encourage? But there's definitely at least trying to stop the kind of lending with no specific kind of social purpose in the first place. There's kind of different points you can try and intervene, if you know what I mean, in this kind of situation. But yeah, I think I'd leave it to Heidi or to Nick to answer about whether civil society, well, particularly, I think it makes a lot of sense from this, as in Global South, citizens of those countries, but I don't know how that links to Global North.
Thank you. Elena, who had the original question, wants to come in quickly.
Hi there, thanks for that. That was helpful. Can I just say the question was ever so slightly different than that, or slightly more nuanced, specifically about these COP negotiations where countries are being asked to, you know, forego pulling their countries out of debt, or just giving their countries enough to eat through using fossil fuels. So India is saying, yeah, we'll go net zero, but 2070, not 2050, because we can't do it. So I meant, to what extent can they hold the debt as a bargaining tool, i.e. you drop our debt and we might commit to some of these things.
I mean, it's a good idea, right? But I think it, in a way, it kind of depends for me. It depends how powerful you are as a country. I mean, some countries would find it easier to do than others because they have more negotiating leverage. If you're a very, very poor, very marginalized, small country, you don't have a lot of power, to be honest with you. But I think that's where the exciting thing, and Sankara talked about this a lot, was the need for a kind of debtors club, really, for countries to come together so that they can exert their power better. Also, do be careful on. So there is a bit of a wave at the moment of northern countries saying, yeah, we might cancel that debt as long as you spend it in exactly the way that we tell you to. And they're dressing that up as on climate change. And they're called debt for climate swaps, essentially. But we need to be really careful there, because on one hand, okay, that looks reasonable. It's certainly better than spending on certain other things. But what's defined as climate change expenditure very often aligns with the interests of the northern country that wants that money spent. And I think if we're talking from a perspective of sovereignty, and we're talking about, you know, we're actually not sure how legitimate some of these debts are anyway, should we really be conceding that actually it's up for the northern countries who ran up these debts through the, you know, the very irresponsible lending and finance system that we've got at the moment? Is it really right that they then get to dictate how the cancelled debts are spent? So you may see some of that discussed in the media increasingly, I think, as the climate crisis and the debt crisis gets worse. And I think we should be really cautious about that. But I mean, I'm absolutely not against at all southern countries using the negotiating leverage they've got. Is brilliant, but I think it's easier for some than others, and I think, you know, in a way, I think that's why I've always been interested in this notion that for many countries they'd actually be better off kind of delinking from parts of the global economy, working together, trading with each other, working on institutions that benefit the people of their own countries, rather than everything as it is at the moment in the global economy. We call it a global economy, but actually it is a neo-imperial economy, because all routes lead back to the old imperial centers, right? It's all about trading with the richest countries. It's all about taking our finance. This is how it works. And, you know, for many countries, that just means impossible levels of competition that they're not able to sustain, and that essentially means, you know, your farming gets wiped out, your industry gets wiped out, and you're importing everything of value from the old imperial centers. And that, for me, is not, apart from very few exceptions, it's very difficult to make that work in development terms. So, you know, I think this idea of countries actually seeing their neighbors as their natural political and economic partners could be really helpful. And defaulting on some of the debt, could well be a part of that.
And thank you so much.
Is there not an opportunity then for talking about the mitigation money, adaptation, mitigation, to make sure that none of those turn out to be debt? I mean, some of them are grants. Adaptation money is more likely to be grants than mitigation money. But still, what are the strings attached? It just feels like
100%.
some turn out to be debt.
And entirely. In fact, I think most of it's debt. I mean, I should know because we've just done a briefing on it, but very, very large amounts of that 100 billion that everyone's been talking about, you know, which is far too little anyway, but a huge amount of it is loans, which is just incredible, right? And a huge amount of it is also simply private money. It's private institutions, right, investing in, well, I don't know, some of it might be useful, but a lot of it is for sure not going to be useful. And even less of it is going to be is going to be subject to the political direction of governments that need to be taking responsibility in this situation. So it's really, you're absolutely right, it's really problematic. And I think the more we point out that a large chunk, and I will find out what the number is, of that amount at the moment is loans, it's a huge problem.
That's 3/4, Nick. I read your briefing.
Ah, wow.
Well, I was,
you know better than I do.
I read your,
How much was it?
I read your briefing while I was at COP. So yeah, but it was really interesting. I must recommend that briefing. It's really good. It's called Financing for Justice. Is it called its name, Nick? Yeah, and so in that briefing, you guys talk about 3/4 of the climate finance being in loans, not grants. And actually, that figure also includes, when we sort of read into a little bit of small print, actually it also includes equity. So it's actually not, it's loans and equity. And I think we don't talk about equity enough, but equity basically is, it's where development finance is used to actually invest so that they get return out of it at the end of it. So either a loan or an equity investment, either way, it's about benefiting the creditor. It's benefiting the global north. And actually, for me, this cuts right, undermines this whole idea of compensation and reparations, because this is about, the global north, taking responsibility for burning fossil fuels for centuries and getting rich off the back of it. And actually, the global south are saying, well, actually, we need, now we are being devastated by hurricanes and cyclones and storms. We've got no money we're paying all this amount of debt, got no money to rebuild, and to avoid us getting into more debt, we need compensation, we need reparations. And so the global rich kind of respond by saying, okay, we'll loan it to you, or we'll invest it into you, and we'll get the interest back on it, and we'll get the original capital back, or we'll get the return on our investment. So the whole thing is just flies in the face of this idea of reparations and climate justice.
Absolutely. And wow. And I think that goes almost to the heart of the refusal to sort of put anything substantial in terms of loss and damage in the COP statement. Rob.
I was also just going to add to Nick's point as well, of Nick D, of that the sort of unifying, if we were able to see our neighbors as our trading partners, that natural, that's not going to be able to happen until the first debt cancellation has happened. So in a way, that's an interesting thing of it has to lead back, because if you still owe, a crazy amount of debt and interest and all of this stuff, obviously in the inverted commas of financial owing, you can't then create that relationship with your partner in a way that's going to free you from that. And there's another interesting thing, which is kind of what I'm researching at the moment. If anyone's got any resources can help me out, that'd be great. Is about the nature of what you sign up to when you take on some of these loans with the private creditors, because it was certainly something Sankara talks about, but at the time then, maybe it's changed, I don't think it has, you actually aren't allowed to unionize as a debtor. That's part of the sort of terms and conditions of taking out these loans, because obviously a debtors union would be incredibly powerful. And so there's another way in which exactly as you're saying, Nick, the neo-colonial, neoliberal, neo-imperial dominant is done by who owns the contract. And then you get back to the UK, because 90% of the bond market for Africa is underwritten in UK jurisdiction. So, that's clearly where the contract, that's who owns the contract, that's who owns the money. And just to answer Eleanor's point as well, there is a group called Climate Just Debt Swaps, CJDS. I haven't looked into them massively yet, but they are certainly looking into the area that your question was about. So maybe that's a good resource to go and research, but I can't say whether that's good or bad, or whether their thinking's been, is really deep or just at all. But it may be great. So that's there. And I just want to say, for time as well, we probably should wrap up, because I think we shouldn't get to the 2-hour mark, because everyone's happier if we don't get there. So Coumba's got her hand up. We should definitely hear from Coumba. And then absolutely, if anyone's absolutely burning to say something, put your hand up now. But otherwise, we need to let our amazing panelists go and ourselves go. And it's been amazing.
Thank you so much. Yes, I just wanted to weigh on the issue we just talked about what is the power and what can the leaders do, especially those who are in the countries that are contracting the debt. And And the conversation that we've been having specifically is the failure of states, at least on the continent, state failure, and the fact that we have many times failed leadership at state level. We have leaders that are clinging to power, wants to stay, and basically are mainly caring just for themselves and for a few people around them. And they are the one representing us and signing these papers, these debts and these things in our names. And the money is not always used for I don't want to say always, almost never used for people. So why would we be continuing paying something that was not like really, put to use for us? So yes, the pressure has to come also first from the people on the continent, being able to stand and understand where and when are these debt contracted, because nobody consults us about it. Nobody tell us when it's signed. So information needs to circulate when the deals are happening, whether it's at the WTO or at a World Bank or at a certain point, wherever it is, we need to be able to be alert. And I think our movements needs to be have the finger at the top of some of this information and be able to circulate it, and so people know, hey, your country or your government or your minister of finance has just flown to this country and he's going to sign this, and did you know? Because, well, you'll be paying it and your children too. So that's something that is extremely needed in terms of information. Also, we are also at a point where right now it's extremely weak at the level of the African Union. Now we were having the conversation with Abdoulaye Bathily, who's a political leader here and has been working in the African Union and all kind of systems. And he says, this is a time where he finds things the weakest there. I mean, there was a time when you had few leaders. I mean, you could like them or dislike them, and they could be bad on any number of things. But you had Abdoulaye Wade, Gaddafi, Thabo Mbeki, and few other people that were somehow pushing some of the ideas of sovereignty, and they came from different countries and could speak to these things. At this point, we have to really look into this group and see who is there, at the AU that can actually stand and say, I can't pay this debt because I have to feed the children in my country, or I have to make sure they have access to vaccine and so on, and be able to push that up and forward. So whether it's just people defaulting for debt or organized, and actually somebody has to go around and talk to them and say, hey, what about these options? Like, are you going to let people into famine or not with no health and continue servicing these debts, or are you going to say something different? But this is also part of our work or our job, and to push them to look at those options. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow, amazing, absolutely. Thank you. Wow, mind blowing as always. Very quickly, just speak to that point you made about the leaders on the continent, linking it to what Nick was talking about, de-linking from the global economy, for example. I think a lot of that was tried in the past, and what generally happened was that leaders were assassinated by the colonial powers, and so on. Anyway, as Rob said, we're close to the 5 o'clock, the 2-hour mark, which we hadn't intended to do. But this is such an important conversation. Thank you all so much for your really, really valuable contributions, and so much to think about and so much to pull together. Hopefully you can write a brief something and share it around that perhaps you could add or contribute to, if that's okay. You could write a brief summary of some of the ideas that were put forward in this roundtable, and then we'll share it around and see if there's anything missing or something that we could work on. Any last words? We good? Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In the absence of any last words, we really are thankful and we appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you so much.
So grateful.
Thanks, everyone. Fantastic discussion.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Coumba. Thanks.
See you, Kumi.
Wow. Coumba threw down some.
I can't end the meeting. It just won't let me. I don't know what's wrong. My iPad gets frozen when we have too many people. I'm gonna just kill the tab.